Welcome to Question Time. Tonight we are in Harrow. On tonight's panel, James Cleverly, the government's Minister for Europe and North America, former chair of the Conservative Party and previously an officer in the Territorial Army. Labour's Shadow Foreign Secretary, formerly Shadow Justice Secretary, promoted by Keir Starmer in last year's reshuffle, David Lammy. Joining us down the line from Washington, Polish politician and journalist, currently a centre-right member of the European Parliament, formerly Polish Defence Minister and for 7 years until 2014, Poland's Foreign Minister, Radislaw Sikorski. Timothy Garton Ash, historian, author and professor of European Studies at Oxford University, focusing in particular on communist regimes in Central and Eastern Europe, and executive editor at The Economist and a former correspondent in Moscow, East Berlin and Ukraine after the fall of the Berlin Wall, Anne McElvoy. Good evening. Welcome to my panel. Welcome to our audience here in Harrow. Welcome to Radek, who's joining us down the line. And, of course, welcome to you at home. Do join in the conversation on this historic and rather sobering day on social media in the usual way at BBC Question Time. Let's hear what you've got to say about tonight's topics. OK, our first question is from Mahesh Pindoria.
Will sanctions against Russia make any difference? And if so, how much death and destruction will we see before they do?
David, do you want to kick us off?
Sanctions are important. They're important because we've got to go after Putin, the people around him. We've got to squeeze them hard. And it's the tool that we have on this occasion. Ultimately, we have to cut Russia out of the Western economic system if it's really going to hurt. Clearly, the days ahead mean that it's not just about sanctions alone. It's got to be about the support we offer to the Ukrainian people, the humanitarian support that will be needed. There'll be many refugees fleeing the country. It's got to be about the political support that we give Zelensky and his government as they do their very best, and military assistance in terms of equipment to fight, and they want to fight, and NATO must support them as best we can without putting troops on the ground in that effort. And so sanctions are important, and they're important over the medium and the long term.
And do you think the sanctions announced so far by the UK, at any rate, go far enough?
Well, look, I welcome the sanctions that the government announced today in Parliament. I do think there's more to do if we're serious about going after this regime. We didn't see Putin named himself as someone who will be subjected to sanctions. We haven't seen the Duma, the Federal Assembly, the parliamentarians on the list. I'm surprised we haven't gone after the insurance sector. He should not be able to de-risk his military endeavour in Ukraine. And clearly, whilst we've banned Aeroflot, there are other airlines and there are other banks that aren't listed. And there are still people who America have got listed as oligarchs, who the EU have got listed as oligarchs, who we haven't. So I think what was announced today in terms of sovereign debt and freezing assets is important. But over the coming days, there's more to do, and Labour will be pressing the government on that. And I hope we see a ratcheting up, because we've got to freeze him out of the Western system. That's how we win this over the long haul.
And Radislaw Sikorski, let's hear your perspective, not only from Washington, but also you were in Ukraine in the last 10 days.
Well, the best sanction is to help the Ukrainians help themselves. And I salute Britain for delivering anti-tank weapons to Ukraine. Anti-aircraft weapons are also being delivered. As regards sanctions, we need to close down the Russian laundromat in the City of London and in the property market in London. These people should not be allowed to steal the money of the Russian people and then to enjoy them in the West and in the various tax havens. We also have to decide whether we want to just give a sign of our outrage, or do we actually want these sanctions to work, in which case there will be pain for us too. We need to make ourselves independent of Russian energy, And we know that cutting them off from the SWIFT system brought the Iranians to the negotiating table as regards their nuclear program. And I think that's a sanction that President Putin would notice, because your ordinary economic sanctions, I think he's costed in as a cost of this operation.
So do you think the sanctions as announced by the President are really not going to make much difference to Putin?
I think it's a good beginning. But as I say, he gathered $630 billion worth of gold and foreign reserves. He doesn't care about the well-being of the Russian people, because if we did, he would be modernizing Russia rather than conquering neighboring states. And his money is in the hands of his cellist, his cook, his oligarchs. We need to tell him that too can play this game of energy dependency. And I hope the European Union forms a gas union, and we will tell him, you sell to us jointly, like we buy uranium at a competitive price, or we will find gas and oil somewhere else.
OK, a lot of hands are shut up in our audience, so let's hear from some of you. Yes, the man there in the blue shirt.
I think the sanctions can only work if the violations are penalized, but when you look at the Britain in the last 5 years, Office of Financial Sanctions Implementation, I think they've only issued about 5 or 6 fines, totaling £20 million. I mean, that's just a joke.
You're talking about the unexplained wealth orders. There have been 4 of those, yes. The man there in the dark sweater, yes.
I believe that this situation has been rattling on for 8 years. The United States originally issued sanctions, and now that with a reaction, you're going to get a reaction. So the European Union will suffer because of high gas prices. The Russians have built up a significant amount of foreign currency during the 8 years to prepare for this situation. They probably will call on probably China for financial resources. So there is going to be a reaction also within the UK as well. We will see significant oil prices, etc., and of course the Ukrainian people itself. So with a reaction, there's going to be a reaction in the world.
All right. And the woman here in the yellow cardie.
Putin is Hitler with nuclear weapons. I'm scared. Are any of you scared? Timmy,
we'll get to the question. Are you scared?
We should all be scared, and we should be prepared for much more threatening behavior coming our way. You know, we keep making the same mistake. We keep thinking this stuff is happening over there in Eastern Europe and it's not going to affect us. It's just some things going on in the Balkans. They said in 1914, then the Austrian Archduke was assassinated and we had the First World War. Neville Chamberlain said Czechoslovakia is a faraway country of which we know little. A year later, we were in the Second World War. Who cares about Poland being engulfed by Joseph Stalin? And we had the Cold War. And as the gentleman rightly pointed out there, this didn't start yesterday. It started 8 years ago. 8 years ago, when Putin seized Crimea, a part of Ukraine, and started the military action in the easternmost part of Ukraine, which is where the trouble started this week. And here's the problem with sanctions. Sanctions are slow. They need to be comprehensive. And the other point made was a very good one. You know, very often the loopholes in sanctions are enormous, and they take time to work. So I think it's important we're putting on these sanctions. I so much agree with David. I do not understand why Vladimir Putin is not on the list. And by the way, if any of you are Chelsea supporters, next time you go to a Chelsea match, unfurl a banner saying, Roman Abramovich, what are you saying to Mr. Putin? Right? Because he's also involved in this.
Well, I have to point out, he's not been subject to any legal process in the UK, and therefore we need to be very careful what we say.
That is perfectly correct, and I don't want a libel action from Roman Abramovich. You're absolutely right. But what I want to say with that is that London has been far too hospitable to people in a broad circle around Vladimir Putin. If we had started doing this in 2014, when Vladimir Putin took Crimea, they would have taken effect, and we might not be in this place facing a major war in Europe.
And do sanctions ever work, Timothy? Is there evidence that sanctions have worked in the past? Is there evidence that sanctions have worked in the past?
So there are two cases, I think, in recent history where sanctions have worked significantly. South Africa, where we also imposed sanctions, they did contribute to the end of apartheid. And Poland in the 1980s, after a state of war was declared in 1981. In both cases, they took about a decade.
All right. The woman there in the jacket, yes, you.
Why is it that Putin doesn't want them to join NATO? And why is it so long to join NATO?
All right.
They said it takes years. Why is that?
All right, we'll come to that in a minute. I'll just get a few more questions. Yes, the man here in the second row in the pink shirt.
Hasn't Putin got the West exactly where he wants them?
All right, and the man here in the red shirt, yes.
Would all this be happening if Ukraine hadn't given up its nuclear weapons that was guaranteed by the West for security?
Right, a lot of questions there. I'm going to work my way around them. James, I'm going to ask you the original question first, and then we'll start answering some of these other ones, which is, will sanctions against Russia make any difference? And do you want to address Timothy and David's point about why isn't Vladimir Putin listed on the sanctions personally?
Look, this is going to be a very frustrating answer, and I apologise in advance, but we never discuss in advance the individuals who might be subject to future sanctions. And I know that is a boring, predictable and frustrating answer.
But why not do it now?
But because we never do it, because...
No, I don't mean why name what you're going to do in the future now. Why not sanction him now?
Well, as I say, we don't discuss who we might sanction in the future. That's the point. But
I'm asking why you don't sanction him now.
We don't discuss who we're about to sanction. So the point is that the sanctions package, that we've announced today is the broadest, most severe sanctions package that Russia has ever seen. David is right that sanctions play an important part, but they are certainly not the whole picture. We have announced an economic support package, a humanitarian support package, because unfortunately refugees and internally displaced people are a sad inevitability of war. And we will also continue working in a coordinated fashion with the EU, with the US, with the G7, with other countries around the world to make sure that there is no international hiding places for the kleptocrats around Vladimir Putin. And whilst he himself is clearly demonstrating a dangerous disregard for the consequences of his actions, we know that putting the financial pressure on the people in his immediate inner circle can and will have an impact on his decision-making. And what we saw is some of these sanctions, I mean, I appreciate what you say about sanctions often taking a long time to build, but just the announcement of the sanctions packages the international community putting in place has already seen a collapse in the Russian stock market, seeing something in the region of $250 billion wiped off the value of the Russian corporate world, just in response to the announcements of sanctions. So they can work, they do work, some take time, some work almost immediately, and they have to be done in coordination with the international community and other actions that we're taking.
Talk about hiding places, that's what you have created already. In a circle, why don't you just go to the man himself?
I know this is really frustrating. We don't discuss who the future designation of sanctions. It's more than frustrating for the people of
Ukraine today, isn't it?
But the point is that the sanctions package that we have put forward, in coordination with the other members of the international community, is the most extensive sanctions package Russia has ever seen, and it will not stop there. We will continue adding sanctions. We will keep ratcheting up the pressure to choke off Vladimir Putin's financial ability to pay for this invasion that he's initiated.
Anne, let's address the original questions, which is, will sanctions against Russia make any difference? How much death and destruction will we see before they do? But also we're getting other points about, for example, has Putin won already?
No, Putin hasn't run already, and I think the gentleman who said, has Putin got the West exactly where he wants it? I don't think so. I think he is playing with fire, not just because he is going to visit such bloodshed and devastation on Ukraine, but what he's doing is very dangerous indeed for Russia. And I think he is really now messianic. I think Putin that I met very briefly many years ago was a much more controlled, more constrained man than he is today. And I'm not going to dwell on what's brought him to that point psychologically. But I think it's slightly dangerous in the West, and it's just a tendency we have to think that this is all bound to, it's only going to go one way, it's going to be Putin's way. There is going to be a terrible conflict in Ukraine, I'm under no illusions about that. But remember how many people in Ukraine, in Belarus, in the Baltic states, across Eastern Europe, in the Balkans, which is also, I suspect, being drawn into this in other ways, not an outright conflict, but it is being played with by the Kremlin. How much faith they have in the West, how much faith they have in pluralism and in democracy. And that is, in the end, the strength that we have here. Now, this is not to be Pollyannish, it's not the evening for that. But please don't forget that what Vladimir Putin cannot win, there is not a winnable state in Ukraine for him. Ukraine is never going to cave in and say, do you know what, you were right, we should just come into the Russian sphere of orbit, we'll forget any other alliances and partnerships and aspirations. That is not what is not going to happen. So it's going to end a different way. A brief word then on sanctions. I think there's a bit of a majority view on the panel. I think I share it. The one thing I would say, it's more important that this is concerted. James, to your point about the British government, just seemed to sort of speed up today, I think it would be fair to say, on its sanctions. Good, because yesterday was a bit mimsy. The list was a little bit, a bit inadequate. But I have to say that would not overnight have stopped anything that was going to happen in Ukraine. But it has to be concerted. And it has to be long. I think a number of people have reflected that. And you have to take people with you. And that is going to be very difficult. Because as Radislaw Sikorski said it earlier, there's a price to be paid for us too. That has been absolutely calculated by the Kremlin. But the people that it hits, I think over time, I think a lot of oligarchs will start to think twice about whether this was such a brilliant idea. I think quite a lot of them have doubts already, in fact. That is, is the case. And last point, sorry, Fiona, but middle-class Russians, particularly very prosperous ones, they profit also. They want to live a nice life, the way we all do. And they profit from having open trade with the West, luxury goods, opportunity, travel. These are things which over time will wear away at Vladimir Putin, but we need to stay big in aspiration. We need to stay united.
And David, I know you want to come in, and I wonder if we could address this, your point about NATO. Should Putin have been allowed to join NATO? I think that's the point you were making. Why does it take so long to join NATO anyway?
Well, there was a moment, if we went back 20 years or so, when Putin was being invited to the G7, and there were discussions. There was a sort of almost a partnership arrangement with NATO. We were in a very different place. But the truth is, we have to be strong now, not weak. And if you look back to 2008, when he went into Georgia, and then to 2014 with Crimea and the Donbass, there are questions about how strong we were at that point. We must be united, not divided. I hope we can make progress on SWIFT. He should be cut out.
So that's just for those who don't, the international payment system. The
international payment system, and I hope that Europe can come to an agreement about that. And we've got to be strategic. One of the problems with the 24-hour media cycle and social media is we've become very short-termist in the West. Our attention spans are so thin, so short. We have to be strategic. We need endurance. This is a long-haul battle. This, it seems to me, is the end of that post-Cold War moment after the collapse of the Soviet Union. It's the beginning of something new. The question is, what is it the beginning of? And the resolve of not just the West, but the global community to stand up to, in the end, what is imperialism, ethnic nationalism, and authoritarianism. And I'm not scared, because in the end, we always defeat that narrow, nasty point of view. And I say that as the descendant of people who had a gun to their head with that sort of imperialist ideal. So we will win, but it takes endurance, a strategic long haul.
Radek, you wanted to come back in.
I'd like to make 2 points. First of all, be careful with that NATO argument, because President Putin was trying to make it sound like it was about Ukraine joining NATO. I was at the NATO summit in 2008 in Bucharest when Ukraine applied and was not admitted, and nothing has happened since then. So he's in effect saying, I have to invade because Ukraine might hypothetically join it in 10 or 20 years' time. And the reason Ukraine has not been admitted is not timing, it's not procedures. It's that if you admit someone into NATO, it means you're willing to go to war for them. And most countries in NATO are not willing to go to war for Ukraine. And so careful with that argument. But Ukraine is not without a chance. In my estimation, if they destroy over 300 Russian tanks and over 100 Russian aircraft, this offensive will grind to a halt.
Right. Well, that's the second part of the question, actually, which is how much death and destruction will we see before sanctions make any difference? That's the second half of your question. Timothy, when in your first answer, you said, you know, we should be careful of what lies ahead. What do you think does lie ahead?
Well, as we speak, the Ukrainians are fighting for their lives, and they are fighting. The Ukrainian army, against vastly superior forces, are fighting, and even if they are in the short term defeated, there's a massive preparation in the population, both for armed resistance, rather like in the Second World War, and for civil resistance, non-armed, civil disobedience. And so David made a very important point. We have to go on helping them, certainly with weapons, but also with communications, with equipment. That's, in a way, the most important thing we can do at the moment. So that's point number one. And the future very much depends on how much resistance there is from the Ukrainians. Second point, we need to ask the basic question what Putin wants. And I think to bring it home to you, what he wants, what this is like, it's like England invading Ireland. It's like England invading Ireland and saying, you basically speak the same language as us, you were part of the same country for a long, long time, so really you belong back with us, so we're going to do you a great favor and invade you to bring you back to us. Putin does not believe that Ukraine is a proper country. I heard him myself in 1994 talking about all these parts that Russia had lost and wanted to win back, and he mentioned the Crimea. So make no mistakes, he wants to destroy Ukraine as a sovereign independent country. And it is our job, along with the Ukrainians, to stop him. It's very difficult to do in the short term, but a lesson of history is the following. Dictators tend to win in the short term. Democracies tend to win in the long term. Hitler and Stalin also won in the short term. They lost in the long term, and so will Vladimir Putin.
The man in the red sweater. The man in the red sweater.
I'm worried that we've got the proportion of this a little too short term, and we think it's a sprint to the finish and not the marathon that you've pointed out is most likely in terms of the effect of the sanctions. And my real worry is that unless we do far better at organising ourselves in a very short order, unlike the way we approached, for example, the start of COVID, my worry is that we will lose the initiative and that we will not have the effect of rebutting the influence of Putin and his acolytes.
And the woman there in the dark shirt.
I just think we've been here before. Has history taught us nothing? This has been going on for years and years and years. There are other places in the world where wars like this, where we have participated and started wars, and look how we've left those countries. Look what we've done around the world. Syria, Middle East, those are those people who are still going through this, and we are doing nothing about that. We go in there, we try to help, and we come away not solving anything. I think we need to really take a hard, strong look at what we're doing, going to the aid of Ukraine and how the situation is going to end. There are things that have been happened in the past that we still haven't resolved, and this could go on for another 50 years. I think we need to wake up and smell the coffee and see what's happening around the world.
So, James, has the government got the will, then, to be in this for the long haul?
Oh, be under no illusion. Be under no illusion. This is unlike I think, almost anything that we've seen in our adult lives. This is the largest accumulation of military might since the Second World War. This is what we now know to be the case, and the intelligence that we put into the public domain gave an indication to this. This has been something that Putin has been brooding over for years. The preparation for this specific attack has been going on for many, many months. The video that he put out this morning, allegedly this morning, we know was videoed days ago, before the vote in the Duma, before the discussion.
Yes, but what the woman was getting at, it's not Putin, how long Putin has been preparing, but whether we, as the UK and the government in particular, is prepared to stay in there for the long haul.
So we know that Vladimir Putin has been planning this for a very long time, and the only way that we will successfully respond to this is by having strategic patience. The point that the gentleman in the red jumper made is that we will only be successful. I have no doubt we will be successful, but we will only be successful because we have a level of international cooperation, the like of which I don't think I have ever seen. I'm on calls a couple of times a week with my US counterpart, my European counterparts, and other members of the G7. We coordinate very, very closely on the sanctions, on the humanitarian support, and the other thing, and I said this morning when I was doing interviews just after the announcement of this invasion took place, the Ukrainian people will be ferocious in their defence of their home country. We have seen before Russian elite forces taking an airfield and then being beaten back off that airfield by the Ukrainian armed forces. These are tough people. They have been fighting for a number of years, and I have no doubt that they will be ferocious in the defence of their country. And we need to be patient in our support because the stakes are so high in this instance. We absolutely cannot, will not allow Vladimir Putin to get away with this. And I give you an absolute cast-iron guarantee that no one in the international community will let this go unchallenged.
I'm going to take another question on this subject in a moment. You just wanted to come back in quickly, Anne.
I did, because what I understood from the lady's question was something of a sense which we haven't really heard, but I think a lot of people do feel, a lot of people watching will be asking themselves questions and talking about, which, if we get involved, are we going to make it worse? We have made mistakes in the past. The West is often very fractured, very fragmented. Not everybody agrees on what the right thing to do is or how far NATO should reach. You know, just looking at you nodding there, I think that's the sense of what you said. Just on a point of fact, when you mentioned Syria, the intervention in Syria that made things immeasurably worse for Syria was Russian support for the Syrian dictatorship. So, I mean, just be a bit careful on the sort of everything that the West touches turns to worse. There are plenty of worse players out there in the world today. And I just feel that there is that element of self-doubt. It is absolutely right for the West to be self-questioning. That's what pluralist democracies are all about. If it was a normal week, we could all probably sit here and find loads to disagree about. And that's the spirit of what it is to live in a democracy. That's why it's worth defending. But right now, we don't actually need to be crippled by self-doubt. We're going to go through a very long and arduous process to support Ukraine, not just because it's Ukraine, because it's the values that, however we might disagree politically, we've seen the political parties coming together. We've seen a completely different mood, I think, in the Commons tonight than we would have seen weeks and months ago in terms of a sense of unity. And on that score, we should be very heartened, and we should take that with us into what's going to be a very difficult fight for our values.
Okay. We're going to stay on the subject of Ukraine. But before I move on, take another question on, I just want to tell you that next week we're going to be in Norwich, and the following week we will be in Walsall, where Gary Neville is going to be on the panel. That'll be his first time on Question Time. We'd love you to join our audience, be part of the debate. So if you live in or around Norwich or Walsall, do get in touch on the BBC website. You can go to the Question Time website there and follow directions, and it'll tell you how to be part of our audience. OK, let's take another question. Sticking with Ukraine, from Steve Williams.
Can you please explain the best and worst case scenarios of what a war with Russia is going to mean for all of us, i.e. the effect of sanctions, cyber attacks, fuel costs and possible shortages?
Now, are you worried about that, Steve?
I'm worried on the basis that we've just come out of a pandemic and obviously have put an awful lot of spend in to try and get the country back into some sort of shape. Obviously, in the last week or so, there's been a huge debate on lateral flow tests and are we going to pay for them, have them, and so on. And obviously, you're looking at prices and such like going up for fuel, for goods, and so on for all of us. This, I think, is probably going to add to the woe that we're going to feel. And yes, I'm concerned as to where this might go, especially over, if it goes for months and possibly years.
Okay. Radislaw Sikorski.
I made the point before that there is no cheap way of doing sanctions, and the gentleman is right that confronting Russia, nobody is talking about going to war with Russia, will be expensive. But think about it this way. A general rearmament of the West, if we find that we have to increase our defense budgets to face an aggressive Putin, will be much more expensive, let alone if he launches a war against the Baltic states and therefore NATO. So I think a bit of economic sacrifice now can save us a great deal of money later.
So, James, a bit of economic sacrifice. I mean, that's a point well made by Radek, but in a sense, if you're the person who's having to make the economic sacrifice, it's not easy at all.
Absolutely. I mean, there is a well-known saying that to govern is to choose. But sometimes in government, you realise that you don't really have a choice. The simple fact of the matter is that the decision made by Vladimir Putin to invade Ukraine will impose a human cost, an economic cost, not just in Ukraine, but across the world. And frankly, we don't have a choice as to whether or not we respond to that. We have to respond to that. Even if we didn't respond to that, and the point that we've just heard, even if we didn't respond to it immediately, those costs would come knocking at our door, those fuel costs, those human costs, the pain and suffering of the Ukrainian people, refugee flows across Europe. These things would be inevitable. We would have to deal with them. It would cost us, and it would cost us dear. Now, the only choice we have is, do we deal with this now? Do we deal with this in a way that hopefully limits that pain and suffering, limits that human and economic cost? Or do we sit on our hands, wait for the pain to come washing up on our shores, as inevitably it will, and then pay a higher price, and higher economic price, a higher human cost? And I think when you look at it that way, and that is how you do have to look at it, frankly, we don't have a choice. We have to deal with this now. We have to deal with this robustly, and we will regret it if we don't.
So what should we be bracing ourselves for then? Because that's the question. What are the best and worst case scenarios? I mean, we've seen the price of oil and gas shoot through the roof today. Should we be expecting far higher energy bills? Should we be expecting cyber attacks on the NHS, as we saw beforehand? What should we be preparing for?
Well, I don't think it would be credible or possible for me to explore all the scenarios. I don't think necessarily it would be politically useful, but defending democracy, defending the rule of law, defending our values does come at a cost, and it's a cost that we have to be willing to pay. And we are going to have to expect aggression, whether it be digitally or physically, from Russia. We are going to have to expect pressure on fuel prices. But as I say, the fact is we don't have a choice in this matter. The choices were made for the entire world when Vladimir Putin did what was a huge strategic error, and that was to invade Ukraine.
Timothy, the best and worst case scenarios.
So James is absolutely right. The food prices would go up a bit, the petrol prices will go up a bit, whatever we do. That's irrespective of us. And it's rather important to say that while Britain has left the EU, it has not left NATO. And the consequence of that is that our front line is at the western frontier of Russia, Belarus, and the Ukraine. That is our front line, and in NATO the principle is all for one and one for all, the Article 5 guarantee. So amongst other things we have to do, and we have no way out of this, we have to ensure the defense of our own eastern frontier. The worst case is that Ukraine descends into such a bloody war that there starts to be a spillover across the frontier to NATO. And I'm sure the Minister doesn't want to talk about this, but NATO has to be seriously concerned about that, because we only actually have a few thousand troops at the front line. The best case is not very good, but the best case is that the Ukrainians are so successful in defending themselves, and that is still possible with a little help from their friends, that they give Vladimir Putin a bloody nose, and he has to sue for peace. He has himself to settle while the ruble plunges through the floor, the Russian stock market plunges through the floor. And by the way, very important point, this is not a war that the Russian people want. This is absolutely clear. I had a very moving account by a Ukrainian friend of mine of a Russian journalist ringing her up early this morning in tears, apologizing for what Russia was doing to Ukraine. So it is still possible, if we are tough in our response, if we stand with the Ukrainians, that he will get a bloody nose. His own people will say, stop, enough.
Over there in the turquoise sweater, yeah.
My concern is that Putin already knows about sanctions. It's not a new word in his vocabulary. He's obviously considered the ruble plummeting, the markets plummeting, international pressure on him, all the sanctions that he's been threatened with. He's ignored. He's gone ahead and still invaded. What else have we got in our ammunition without literally using ammunition to de-escalate where we are today?
All right, the man there in the blue shirt.
Yeah, isn't part of the base problem that the West as a whole, and the UK in particular as well, has cut and cut and cut the size of our armed forces over the last decade? So no wonder that other countries don't see us having the same strength that we used to have, and maybe we should be spending more on things like the armed forces and less on things like Brexit.
Quite sure how that calculation would be made. I was about to say, I was pleased you brought up the armed forces. I do rather agree with you on that. I would say, however, Britain does pay its NATO dues. We pay properly what is asked for us there. We are very active in NATO. Just as I know, God, the B word had to come up though, didn't it? But I just want to say one thing on this, because everyone will have their view in the audience on Brexit. I think this is the time when we can really put some of those rows, some of those fissures, which I know are very deeply held. This is the time to put that aside. There's plenty to be sorted out on Brexit. There is plenty that still needs to be addressed, and as if you're pro it, you think is not factored in enough or not celebrated. If you're against it, you're thinking with so many problems, Northern Ireland Protocol, etc. Of course, that needs to happen. It's the job of government to do it, and the opposition to be constructive and critical at the same time. But I sometimes think we have indulged ourselves in the West in getting into arguments that really we're almost blinding ourselves to the bigger picture. Now we've had this rude reminder. I do agree with you on spending, but I would say, I was just reading this morning, everyone was probably too busy doing more, going on with their lives, but the head of the German army has written a screed complaining about the fact that he has been left in a position where he doesn't feel that the army can step up in Germany, in the biggest, the richest, the most potentially powerful country in Europe. And this is not just a British problem. We have, to an extent, we've all ducked it. We all thought we had better things to do. Well, now we find that this is the thing to do.
Radek.
Well, I just like to back up the argument of the last gentleman, because most people don't realize how far the West has disarmed in the last couple of decades. Let me give you just one piece of statistic. Germany has 250 tanks. France has 240 tanks. Britain has 200 tanks. Russia, I double-checked because I couldn't believe it, has 13,000 tanks, of which about 3,500 are quite modern. We have to stop consuming the peace dividend because peace is over.
But Radek, no one is suggesting, even with all the tanks in the world, that the West would go into Ukraine or that would actually fight Russia. Or is that something that you want to be held in reserve as a real possibility?
No, of course not. But to be credible in deterring President Putin, you have to have a counterforce. And we don't.
David.
Look, I think that if you're Putin, you see Biden sinking in the polls, you see Boris Johnson sinking in the polls, You see Emmanuel Macron facing an election in France. You see a new president in Germany. You see rising inflation in all of those countries. And you see an energy crisis looming. And you pick your moment. And this is his moment. And so the question for us, and there was a question about the pain. Yes, there will be pain. And this is the time for sober, honest, frank politicians. And we certainly need a Prime Minister who's prepared to do that, to say to the British people that, yes, there will be some pain. But we are fighting for something here. And that's not just democracy and a way of life in Ukraine. That's all of our ways of life. Because this is dangerous precisely because Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Poland are part of that NATO alliance, and that's the next flank. And if we allow him to move to that next flank, then the way of life that allows us the luxury of being on this programme and allows me and James the quarrels that we have regularly in Parliament is over. Is that worth fighting for? Of course it's worth fighting for. What we now need are sober leaders who are prepared to be honest with the public and explain that in clear and crystal clear terms. And yes, we absolutely need more spending on our armed services. The peace, the austerity that we've all seen, I'm afraid, has, is challenged hugely by this moment and the seriousness of it.
Matt here.
Can I just ask, did David just did make a pledge to raise defence spending under a Labour government?
You did seem to be suggesting that you would spend more on the armed forces.
Just write it down for later.
I think you did.
We have been very critical of the spending on the armed forces. I'm quite sure a future Labour government would spend more. It's clear that the moment that we're in, and the reliance that we will need on the United States particularly, because there will now be more troops on the eastern flank, require European countries to step up.
But there's also, if I may, one other thing that this government can do. So I was a passionate Remainer, passionately opposed to Brexit, but Anne is absolutely right. There can be no Remainers or Leavers faced with an existential challenge like this. We have to be together. But there is something else we can do, which is in the last couple of years we've had a very bad relationship with the EU, with our European partners. And if we're to sustain the unity of the West that we have all been talking about, then this is the perfect moment to try and reset and repair our relationship with our European partners, as well, of course, as our good relationship with the United States, because heavens above, we have a common enemy, a common threat. And that's so important because the gentleman over there said, we will pay a price. That's true. But Germany gets 55% of its gas from Russia, about a quarter of its oil. So the lights threaten to go out in Dusseldorf and Munich if Putin turns off the gas tap. So the potential cost for our continental partners, also Italy, also many East European partners, is very high. So it really needs a coordinated approach, Britain with our European partners, with the rest of the West.
James, very briefly.
So I'm the Minister for Europe and North America, and the point you've just made about the importance of cooperation and joint working is absolutely true. And I have to say to you, the conversations I'm having with my French and German counterparts, I had a series of phone calls today, including with the United States, this has inevitably brought us more closely together very, very quickly.
So the days of Boris Johnson saying to the French, prenez un grit, there
are still always going to be challenges and frictions in a bilateral relationship. That is inevitably the case. But we are working so closely on the sanctions, so closely on the support packages, and actually, I know there will always be fun games to be had trying to find divisions between the US, the UK, and our European partners. But we are coming closer together over this issue than I could possibly have hoped for, and I'm really, really pleased that we are.
We haven't got that much left on the programme. A number of you asked about the fact that the COVID restrictions are being lifted in England today. Do you want to move to that, or do you want to keep talking about Ukraine? Ukraine. OK, well, let's keep going on that. Let's hear from the man here in the white cardigan.
Yeah, Radek mentioned about the the London laundromat, and it's not something we should be proud of that we have it here. The anti-money laundering legislation has been there for decades. Banks get occasionally fined, but it's a bit of a magnet for dirty money. There's been golden visas. Perhaps it's an opportunity to revisit those. I think 12,000 in the last 7 years. And also football club was mentioned, but it's not the only football club that has dubious funding. So perhaps it's an opportunity to clean up the whole act, because it's a bit of an embarrassing that we have this dirty money.
The woman in the middle, towards the back. The woman in the middle towards the back, if you can get a microphone that far.
So we talked about the pain in the short term, but are we doing anything to mitigate that pain? So things like focusing on cybersecurity, investing more in things like that, rather than just focusing on the armed forces. We should also protect ourselves and look after security within our country as well.
You're nodding your head there.
Yeah, and I've come from an armed forces background. I've been reserve forces officer for most of my adult life, so I am biased. But it's not just about the number of soldiers. And actually, as well as being the Minister for Europe and North America, I'm also the Minister for Space. And actually, satellites.
What, the whole of space?
The whole of space.
Wow.
The whole of space.
Have you got all the jobs that the government's got?
I'm still yet to meet the ambassador.
OK, so what about cyberspace? Taking greater steps to protect us from cyber attacks?
So we've recently updated our cybersecurity strategy. Things like satellite protection. Russia, quite recently, didn't make the headlines, but Russia fairly recently blew up a satellite causing really dangerous debris in orbit around the Earth. These are all areas where we have to defend ourselves, and we have to spend money defending ourselves. So yes, our armed forces are important, and as I say, I'm biased in that respect, but the points you make are just perhaps even more important to make sure we get right, because we are under attack in all those realms on almost a daily basis. And I have to say, and before we lose time in the programme, I have to say that David and I have had plenty of rows in our career, but today what we saw is the front bench, the Labour front bench, the SNP, being critical, but absolutely being supportive in what we're ultimately trying to achieve. And I think that's been reflected this evening. I think it shows us at our best.
You weren't looking that supportive just now about protecting against cyber attacks.
I've got to be a bit critical because, look, the authoritative piece of work on the resilience that our country needs was done in a cross-party way by our intelligence committee of MPs across the House of Commons and the House of Lords. And they produced the Russell report. And we are still waiting to see that report properly implemented.
And
it has taken until this crisis.
Just give us some idea, as a headline, what we would expect to see.
We need to know who owns those houses where the lights are off in Kensington. 250 houses owned overseas. We've got no ideas. We need to crack down on those shell companies. We've got drug running in London with money going round. We're the cocaine capital of Britain in London, with kids being trafficked. What are we doing about it? Not nearly enough.
But surely we had Russian money going around London when Labour was in power as well?
Look, the Russia report was look, I don't want to be that partisan. Of course, this story began when we were in power. I accept that. But it's got considerably worse. We have a report. It's not been implemented. And it's right that my party also says to correct. Why is it that we've had a change to our election bill that means that political parties can receive donations from nationals over uncapped? Why did we do that? And why won't you give that 2 million back that that Russia-linked, Putin-linked people gave to your party? Give it back. And if you're not going to give it back...
I mean, they're British citizens now.
They're British citizens,
David. Give the money to the Ukraine Resistance Fund. Do it and stand above it all for once. Do it.
So,
you were chairman of the party.
David,
you were chairman of the party when some of this money came into your coffers. And
David, the donations are made by British nationals. If you're saying...
Dual nationals, many of them.
Oh, so we're now... Whoa. So we're now writing off dual nationals. Is that what you're saying?
One of them.
So, David, you've had plenty of
former finance minister in Putin's regime.
You've had plenty of time. You've had plenty of time to shout at me. So
former finance minister in Putin's regime.
Do you want to just keep talking? Do you want to do a bit of listening?
How long do we have to listen?
Okay,
how long do we have to listen?
Well, let's hear the answer, and then we'll hear some more from the audience.
So the donations that we received from British nationals, legitimate donors, registered with the Electoral Commission, and I think you should be very, very careful of just implying that all Russians are dirty, all Russian money... Well, hang on a second. So why pick on one particular donation? Why pick on one particular donation? So my family has come from a country, Sierra Leone, which has had corruption. And I would be deeply, deeply offended if you were to imply that all Sierra Leoneans were dirty because some Sierra Leoneans are.
James.
And so to suggest... No, David, you've done a lot of talking. So to suggest that all donations from Russians are somehow dirty because some Russians are corrupt is deeply, deeply racist.
No.
And if you were to do it against any other racial group, you would be pilloried.
I'm sorry, hang on a minute.
Timothy, you're sitting there with a wry smile on your face listening to this. Would you like to share your thoughts?
I was just thinking it's a great example of Western unity we're showing. You know, I do remember Peter Mandelson swanning on a yacht with, I think his name was Oleg Deripaska, a notable Russian oligarch, so it is both parties. But I think the larger point is that we in Britain as a whole have been just far too welcoming to dirty money, by the way, not just from Russia, from all over the world, from China, from the Middle East, from everywhere. And it's become a real running sore of our country, and I think we together have to do something about it.
Thank you. Yeah, we're talking about protecting the principles of democracy, and what I've seen of late is actually I just feel really embarrassed of our political leaders. Is Boris really the man to lead us through this when he's proven himself to either be stupid or a liar? I'm not sure which. And I just feel embarrassed.
Actually, I've been very critical of Boris Johnson, you know, kind of on and off, I think, been critical about ever since I met him, and I think that's about 30 years ago. But, you know, I wonder if he's really been so bad in this crisis. I think he gave a good speech at the Munich Security Conference. I thought he was rather good today. As I say, I would have wanted him to go a bit further, faster on the sanctions sooner, but it would not have prevented what was going to happen overnight and is happening today. No, I don't really. The Conservative Party can sort out its own troubles with Boris Johnson and its Partygate allegations. And of course, there will be the kind of robust discussion we've just seen on the panel between two warring political parties. But this is the time, I'm afraid, where I do look at that kind of criticism and say, I'm sorry, because you obviously feel it very strongly, you know. We'll have to drink together afterwards. But I just think this is what it is. This is what a parliamentary democracy is. It is that you can feel so strongly that you can sit here and say this on a programme that you could not say this now on Russian television in any mainstream way, not just on Russian television, but increasingly, you know, being clamped down on everything, on the internet, in the papers, in the magazines. The Russia that I knew, with its small areas of freedom, free expression, is being stamped out. So I suppose that's why I say at the moment, let's be critical of our leaders, our oppositions, when they deserve it. But let's cut ourselves some slack and get on with this.
Radek, I don't know if I could see you want to come back in. I don't know if that's in response to whether Boris Johnson is the right man to be fronting this for the UK at the moment.
Well, I think credit where credit is due. Boris's decision to send anti-tank weapons to Ukraine was brave and timely. To send British troops to Poland was also good. And I have to tell you, hearing him in the last few days on Ukraine, I wish we had him on the European Council arguing for tougher sanctions.
The man in the red sweater.
Yeah, I was just wondering if perhaps this is going to be an opportunity for Boris to have his finest hour.
OK, and yes, the man there in the blue jumper, yes.
Obviously, Crimea and the action we took against Crimea, against Russia when they invaded Crimea didn't work.
and then now he's invaded the whole of Russia. What happens if he invades another non-NATO country? What do you think the action should be then, given that the sanctions are not working?
Timothy, is that something that you are concerned could happen? I mean, you've talked about the fact that he's going to take, by invading Ukraine the way that he has, he's right on the border of the NATO states. Do you think it's a real concern that he will go further?
So he has effectively already invaded Belarus, which is just next to Ukraine, because he put all his forces in there and they're there for as long as he wants them to be there. So what...
But obviously Belarus will... I mean, it's a friendly state to Russia, Belarus.
Well, I mean, not if you ask the Belarusian people.
Okay.
Who
In terms of the leader, I take your point. In terms of the leader,
a
yes.
pro-European candidate, and then, the election was stolen in traditional fashion. So I think the minimal aim of Vladimir Putin is to create a new Iron Curtain down the eastern frontier of NATO, so that countries like Belarus, Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia would be stuck in the Russian Empire, whether they like it or not. The other point to make, and it's an excellent question, and this was a point made to me by a very senior NATO general. NATO and the EU have had a very close relationship with Ukraine for many years. Someone once said, Ukraine is not in NATO, but NATO is in the Ukraine. Ukraine is not in the EU, but the EU is in the Ukraine. And what this general said to me was, we have all sorts of non-alliance partners all over the world. Where is our credibility going to be with them? And one of them is Taiwan. And of course, if someone asks the worst-case scenario, one worst-case scenario is Xi Jinping thinks, well, if Comrade Vladimir can get away with it in Ukraine, maybe I'll have a go in Taiwan.
Radek, where do you see this going?
Well, I think Putin is slightly running out of places to invade within the former Soviet Union. Remember, he just recently sent troops into Kazakhstan. They were apparently withdrawn under Chinese pressure. And he already has troops in Moldova, which was a former Soviet republic. So next on line are former Soviet republics that are in NATO. And, that would be very serious.
And how much is this thought exercising the government, James?
Oh, very much, very much. I mean, the last call I made, and this is the reason why I was a little late coming to the studio, the last call I made was with the Moldovan foreign minister, who has Russian troops in his country, not at their invitation, I might add. And the simple truth is that Vladimir Putin has told us what his aspiration is, and it is to recreate that Russian empire. And you're completely right. He wants to put a new Iron Curtain down the centre of Europe, from the Baltic to the Black Sea. And there are a number of countries who had moved towards liberalism and openness and democracy that he wants to drag, kicking and screaming, at the point of a bayonet back into his orbit and strip those things away from him. That's what's at stake. That's what we have to prevent. And that's why the discussion we've had this evening is so very, very important. It is probably the defining question of my political career, probably my adult life.
Well, I'm afraid we're out of time. Our hour is up. Who knows where we'll all be next week, what the situation will be? I have no idea, but I know we'll be discussing this next week again, I very much suspect. Thank you very much to the panel for coming this evening. Radislaw Sikorski, thank you so much for joining us from Washington. We really appreciate your time. Thank you to our audience here in Harrow. And of course, thank you to you at home for watching. From Question Time in Harrow. Bye-bye.